Thank you. Benjamin P. Davis is an assistant professor in Africana Studies and Hispanic Studies at Texas A&M University. He's the author of three books: Simone Weil's Political Philosophy, Field Notes from the Margins. Book number two, Choose Your Bearing, Edouard Glissant, Human Rights and Political Ethics, and Another Humanity, Decolonial Ethics from DuBois to Arendt. Dr. Davis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Phoebe, for having me. I would like to thank Chanel as well for the invitation and Oscar for the email logistical work, as well as a few other people in this group, Professor McConey for the space and engagement, and Jane Gordon and Frida Ikato, who were instrumental in getting me to Nelson Mandela University last summer, where I met Chanel in person and had a lot of important conversations that influenced this book. It's also good to see Alan and Rebecca from Africana Studies at A&M. Thanks for coming this morning. So, as mentioned, yeah, I won't take up 40 minutes. It'll probably be closer to 25, just to talk through a little bit, and I'll look forward to your questions. The book is really coming out of two summer research projects, one in Palestine a couple years ago, working with academics there, and the other in South Africa last summer, as you saw in my introduction. As I promised on the abstract, I'll talk a little bit about Edward Said and Jacques Derrida and their theoretical influences on the book. It's sometimes forgotten that Said grew up in Cairo and Derrida in Algeria. So I want to mention this out of respect for this African studies space, and to talk a bit about or situate this knowledge production on the continent. I'll move a bit from the north in Cairo and Algeria to the south when I talk about Dimitri Erasmus at the end. So, although Said was born and baptized in Jerusalem, it was Cairo that served as the anchor of his childhood, according to his biographer, Timothy Brennan. What was Said's North Africa? We know it was life as a minority within a minority. He was an Anglican amidst an already Christian minority. But the Said family was wealthy due to his father's store, which sold stationery and office supplies to the occupying British Army. So Said, I think, in part from this background in Cairo, this time in Cairo, as he went on to become one of our most important post-colonial theorists, had this ability to think through paradoxes and contradictions that would be helpful to so many of us. I liked the line in the abstract of this space that the only universality is through complexity. I think Said's attention to paradoxes in some ways exemplified and embodied that. But it was a very particular Said I was interested in writing this book. Really the lesser known Said in some way, the lesser studied Said in some way, the Said who writes about human rights and self-determination and dispossession. So we have Orientalism in 1978, and only 1 year later, he wrote The Question of Palestine. Similarly, we have Culture and Imperialism from 1993, and only 1 year later, The Politics of Dispossession. But at least in the North American Academy, which is the only one I can really speak to, the only one I really spent time in, if people do read Said, it's usually Orientalism and maybe Culture and Imperialism. And it's much more rare that we see sustained engagements with the question of Palestine, and even less with the politics of dispossession. So I want to think a bit about this, why that might be, and how that has shaped post-colonial theory and the questions that are asked. On the one hand, Said played an important role introducing Derrida and Foucault, this line of French post-structuralism, to the US Academy early on. And I've spent all this time in his archive, and you can see on his syllabi, he was teaching in French Derrida and Foucault in the 70s. But by the 90s, as he's writing The Politics of Dispossession, he becomes very critical of post-structuralism, comparing the whole enterprise to checking into a private resort. It's a line in The Politics of Dispossession. So in this less academic, in a way, more political side of Said, he maintained these political concepts that theory, post-structuralist theory, has asked us to interrogate and abandon: the humanity, human rights, sovereignty, self-determination, the grand emancipatory vocabulary of the 20th century, really. So the question I had was, why did he keep these terms? Particularly given his attention to the importance of the critiques of them. And I think one answer is his commitment that intellectual life must be public life. I was thinking of this when thinking whether should I sign the recording agreement, we publish these kind of things, but he insisted that intellectual life is public life, always against insularity, against hermeticism, against closing down dialogue, which he knew a specialist vocabulary can do. And I have so admired his pursuit of inquiry in writing that is worldly, meaning not just, international or planetary, but writing that was engaged and concrete and outward oriented and accessible more toward the world as it is lived. And my sense is by the 1990s, he saw in the critical theory of French post-structuralism a discourse that was getting more and more incestuous, more and more withdrawn from political life, more and more abstract, away from public and political engagement. And this has really been on my mind, not only in the past few years, as we've watched near complete silence from so many US and North American educational institutions on Palestine, but also as we have seen this recent iteration of the Trump administration start to challenge the status of international students, for instance. And there has been so little forthright speech from our administrations in the university and institutions that even name this as a problem or as something we're willing to challenge in standing up for our institutions. So my sense is his point wasn't that we don't have inner lives, private lives, spiritual lives, although he was a very secular person himself. But I think his point was more about the public stands that we're willing to take or not take as intellectuals, which was a word he used, instead of scholar, instead of academic, instead of professor, all these other terms that we've seen maybe contributes to a withdrawal into a more private, insulated vocabulary. So in this book, Another Humanity, I found Said's example helpful in my own context, where it's become increasingly fashionable to pursue decolonial research projects. This wasn't really always the case. And in my experience, at least, starting with Latin American thought, um, there were very few people taking these questions on, in philosophy at least, the discipline I'm trained in. And before George Floyd, uh, it was seen maybe more as a liability than anything, though that has somewhat changed. But the connection I want to make to Said's legacy, in a way, that I tried to speak to a bit in the introduction of Another Humanity, is how, as far as I can tell at conferences, many of these projects, more and more, have very little attention to land and political struggle in community or international work, and often revolve around showing how some concept or author is connected to imperial projects, and then arguing that the concept or author is no longer useful. I would say this is a method of rejection more than of reconstruction. And I take from Said that conceptual life, political life in the 21st century is deeply entangled with colonial history, of course. But you see in the question of Palestine and the politics of dispossession, this method of nevertheless leveraging widely legible concepts, even and especially despite their colonial entanglements. And I wonder if this is partly influenced by his youth in Cairo, his family's entanglements with British rule, his own US citizenship and elite education, that saw him give us a method where location is not determining, and he's always going to be against filiation, meaning family ties, and for affiliation, meaning something like chosen ties and political struggles. So in this way, as you saw, the book is against some of the grain of contemporary critical theory, and against some of the grain of contemporary decolonial theory, in that I defend the concepts of the human and humanity and human rights, despite their limitations. For me, they remain legible, widely legible starting points for conversation and action. And I see that legibility, which many criticize as a limitation and a compromise, as in fact a strength. And to try to prove this point in a way, I look backward to 5 philosophers who no doubt were aware of the limitations of these concepts because of their own experiences of exile and dispossession, but who kept them and leveraged them reconstructively and creatively: DuBois, Glissant, Winter, Said, and Arendt. So to put this one more way before I start to speak about Derrida as promised, it would be to say, I know in this group and in many places, we have read Nelson Maldonado Torres's influential article on the coloniality of being. And one way that idea has been taken up is to pursue research projects suggesting the coloniality of a thinker or a given topic. So you see this more and more: Nietzsche and coloniality, or Alain Badiou and coloniality, or whatever. Pick some philosopher and then reveal that. And I have interpreted the thesis in a somewhat different direction, thinking, okay, if this is right, then we can grant this widely and no longer search for some kind of pure exteriority, pure outside, uncontaminated concept, person, idea, whatever it may be. And instead, it is liberating in a way, because it allows for us to change the project toward a more strategic one. This is really the Caribbean influence on the book, that doesn't believe in some kind of pure whatever outside of capitalism, outside of colonialism, and begins from the density of the entanglements. Stuart Hall would say this is politics without guarantees. No concept, no person, no idea carries with it this guarantee. And so the task is different to strategically leverage, reconstruct concepts in the most public way possible, as widely legibly as possible. Okay, so that is really the influence of Said to begin, and the lesser known, lesser studied Said of The Question of Palestine, 1979, and The Politics of Dispossession, 1994. This call to defend the concepts we have in our political life now and use them publicly. Okay, now, where does Derrida fit in? Derrida has told the story many times of growing up in Algeria, and at the age of 12, being told he could no longer attend classes at public school because he was Jewish, and the Vichy government, collaborating with the Nazis, had rescinded the citizenship of Algerian Jews. And I have long been moved by this story he tells repeatedly, and that he somewhat credits for maintaining a commitment to forms of life where the force of law we are born into doesn't have the final say. But I must say, until this morning, really, I have so avoided talking about Derrida or Derridians or deconstruction for a few reasons. One is, at least in the academic context I'm familiar with, if you bring up Derrida, you open yourself to the whole critical apparatus that have allowed so many people to make a name, a career on another person's name. And so one often can find defensive responses. And I didn't want really to enter that conversation. I wanted to write about what it means to be human and how we deny that meaning so often in everyday life, and not be this long-standing debate about Derrida where you invoke the name and then you have to defend, I would have to defend my claims against every book, every footnote, every seminar, everything Derrida ever said. I wanted to avoid that. And let me give an example that's memorable. There were a few years ago, I was at a conference on comparative literature at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I love Georgetown, those of you who have been there, because it's a great city for stationery and pens. And like Said, I really like pens and have spent way too much money on the Georgetown neighborhood, getting envelopes and letters and pens. But in any case, I'm at this literature conference and someone on the panel cites Derrida to theorize the Haitian Revolution, freedom in the Haitian Revolution. And I said, and we've all seen this in a way, the role that theory can take, thinking through political events. And I said in the Q&A, I don't know if this project needs Derrida. Surely the revolutionaries already had a robust concept of freedom that guided them in some way. And I wonder what that would be. And this panelist said in response, well, in graduate school, when she was stuck on what to write about, Derrida saved her life. That was her answer, really. And I didn't know how to, how do you respond to that, in terms of engagement? So I was trying to make this point that I don't like the assumption that political movements and political practices don't already have theory built into them, and that need some kind of, academic who's perhaps never faced state violence to make sense of what's really happening. But Derrida, it seems, has saved many lives or at least many careers. So I've tried to avoid talking about him, but at the same time, I have loved reading, Abdel Kabir Katibi and his concept of double critique in plural Maghreb, Stuart Hall and his writings on difference and identity in the 1990s, Sylvia Wynter on the horizon of humanity. And all of these engagements are with Derrida in a way, to get to those places. So here we are. I'm talking publicly for the first time about thinking with some deconstruction, because at the end of the introduction to Another Humanity, I thought I needed a key insight from deconstruction, namely that concepts are ultimately unstable and that they are fragile cuts in an ongoing, inherited terrain of history. So I wanted to hold together, on the one hand, this opening argument that, from my perspective, thinking especially about participating in movements for land rights in the Americas, where we need some concepts to work in the struggle. On the one hand, from my perspective, critical theory, academic critical theory, has become too theoretical, too withdrawn from life as it has lived, too insulated and insular. And I'm interested with Stuart Hall in a sense of political strategy that would still allow us to utilize the most important concepts we have, that our ancestors have used before us in working toward a more liberated future. But on the other hand, I like the reminder from deconstruction that these concepts we need strategically should still not have the final hold on us. One example that comes to mind, just from doing work against some oil pipelines, is sovereignty. In the Americas, at least, sovereignty remains a very helpful concept for trying to stop a pipeline and respecting indigenous rights. But as many thinkers and as deconstruction certainly reminds us, sovereignty is not the most robust of human political forms of organizing ourselves. So I wanted to hold those tensions together in some way, reading Said and deconstruction together, to say we need these concepts and to deconstruct them along the way. So for me, that means showing how useful some flawed, contaminated concepts still are, first among them the human and humanity, also human rights, also civil rights, also sovereignty and repair. So eager was I to avoid this conversation in a way that I don't cite Derrida directly, but I did learn to be fair, that he does have, though this was after writing the book that I learned this, but he does have a part of Spectres of Marx where he's surveying the fragile planet in the early 90s, looking at civil wars and international wars and what the human rights regime has brought us, and speaks of this idea of double interpretation. Concurrent readings, he says, that the picture seems to call for. And he says at the moment it calls for another politics and another concept. And I am skeptical of the search for another concept, as I have mentioned, because I think that arrogates too much power to the theorist in a way, as if we can create a neologism and that will somehow help us more than the political concepts that are legible to connect struggles. But I love this search for another politics. So Derrida calls this double interpretation. And for me, that is still too textual. It takes us, it returns us to a textual question when with Said, I'm interested more in public lived questions. So the concept I found helpful to think together this strategy plus reminder that this term shouldn't have the final say was what Dimitri Erasmus calls double politics. I'm moving us south now. But I will say at the beginning, when I talked to Chanel and other colleagues about Erasmus, I'm reminded that she is a non-racialist. So I want to add that it is not my orientation, but I find this concept and her work overall quite helpful. So early on in Another Humanity, I cite Erasmus in her critique of apartheid racial categories, who says, writing about what double politics means, focusing on race, that it means to acknowledge the ways in which race continues to matter while working towards its undoing. And I try to expand this idea of double politics, not only to race, but to the idea of a nation or to rights or to sovereignty, acknowledging the political use of these concepts for the strategic gains we need to make, but not wanting to grant that thinking in nationalist terms needs to have the final say on human life. Okay, so this is how I got from Said to Derrida to Erasmus. What else to say at the end, because I promised I would be mercifully short and I want to honor that. I decided I wanted to speak a bit about returning us to Said and what he calls the idea of Palestine. The idea of Palestine. That when I was teaching in Black Studies in St. Louis, a colleague of mine in the Theological Studies department told me about this lecture Said gave that was broadcast eventually on KPFA radio out of Berkeley, California. It's just a 30-minute lecture you can find if you search KPFA Edward Said on the idea of Palestine. But what so calls to me about from that interview in our time is an echo, in a way, he makes of a claim from the question of Palestine, where he says, when he's speaking about Palestine, he's speaking about land, no doubt, but also about something else. It's an idea, he says in the radio broadcast, about land, about the right of a people to their homeland, to national self-determination, all of that. But it is also, he says, not about exclusion. It's an idea about living community, living in a human community of equality. It is about living humanly together in a part of the world that is saturated with blood, he says, and yet the idea goes on. So for me, living with equality in human community, this aspirational ideal, is the ideal that Palestine keeps alive and has become something of an orienting point that I think this virtual forum embodies in many ways, which is that amidst the struggles we are part of and witnessing right now, in many ways over this very idea of human community, whether it's possible, or what Sylvia Wynter said at a higher level of abstraction, predicting that this century would be a century where we would struggle over the reigning idea of what it means to be human. Said says this idea it needs to be fought for internationally and never attached just to one nation, never attached just to one tradition, but if anything, from a position of intellectual exile. So I hope the book is a contribution to these struggles over what it means to be human. And I take inspiration from Said's emphasis on this idea and the need in turn to make connections across places and histories and show how we are implicated in each other's struggles, and that public work can be part of philosophy just as much or more powerfully than limiting ourselves to critical work or inventing new terms. I want to say at the end, I think this is work this forum and many other spaces have already started to do. It's also work that South Africa has done in its creative legal efforts at the ICJ, which I want to name and appreciate. So thank you for this opportunity to talk about the book. Thank you, Chanel, for the invitation to speak this morning, and I'll look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Davis. Dr. Makoni, you're on.
Thank you very much, Ben. I would like to engage in a conversation with you, but perhaps starting from a slightly different perspective. I'm not personally convinced, for example, that we have reached a stage where we don't need any new concepts. I would like to argue, for example, that there are a lot of concepts, philosophical concepts, which are a defining feature of African philosophy, which have not found their way into mainstream academic work, which, if they had been redeployed or utilized within academy, they would have enabled us to move a bit further. And I will cite 4 examples to try and exemplify what I mean. The first one, I think, is the sort of well-known notion of, let's say, humanity and its interconnectedness, what is called in different parts of Africa, Ubuntu. But you also have concepts that deal with issues about balance and justice, or MAT. And you also have African philosophers writing quite extensively about the distinctions between person, personhood, community, and communitarianism. And then the last one could be environmental stewardship. The issue for me, I think, is that the problem we are confronted with is not so much that decoloniality has become fashionable. I'll come back to that. But it's a failure to realize that what we basically are arguing for here is not that the research should be based in Africa or should take land, etc., should take into account issues about land, but that we are interested in exploring and creating a form of thinking in which Africa is a way of thinking and imagining the past, the present, and the future. And if you follow that argument, then you create a completely different world vision that you create, which requires, in actual fact, more concepts rather than fewer concepts. And then I've always found it very difficult to fully understand the critique that says decoloniality is fashionable. When you then look at the philosophers or the critiques that they're talking about, most of them are South American. You have this large number of African philosophers from ancient Egypt, Sheikh Anta Diop, Maliki, John Mitty, Wiredu, Yanka, etc., hardly mentioned in that whole enterprise. From that perspective, we've hardly begun the business of trying to work through how decoloniality is thought out by this massive body of scholars. We have had a big impact to some extent, even on the works of people like Lewis Gordon, etc., etc. That's my rambling note. But that is not important. The most important thing, I think, which I wanted to get to hear from you is this. What would Said's view be about framing what you are calling human rights? How does he understand the notion of human rights, and what sort of distinction does he draw, at least between human rights, between being human and nature? Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Professor McConey. Now, I mean, I think we are more aligned on the first point than maybe
Mm-hmm.
made it sound, in the sense that the examples you gave, whether it's Ubuntu or, as mentioned in the chat, Matt, or these other concepts, these are already existing,
yes,
in community concepts, not invented
yes,
terms
yes,
that no one might understand outside
yeah.
of the journal.
Mm.
So I think that the sense that the task might be to democratize, publicize those concepts, we're totally on the same page.
Okay.
My concern is more, I don't know, the modern prejudice toward the new, maybe.
Okay.
In the sense that, an academic can invent, in my own brilliance, a concept more helpful than something that's been circulating, and can be re-articulated in a given context. So definitely an agreement on that. And in fact, I take your second point, certainly. And I agree completely if you looked at, the biggest, most powerful academic conferences I'm familiar with. Certainly, I hear what you're saying, that the work of Lewis Gordon and Sheikh Anta Diop and these others you're mentioning are not discussed in those places. That's true. I think my concern is more, how to say it. If you looked, and this is probably, I'm trying to be careful, because this might not at all be a concern in the spaces you all are working in, but the conferences I've been to across the Americas and in the past 2 years, where people are talking about decolonial theory, postcolonial theory, but at a certain level, such that if you looked at the conference program, at the titles of everything said, you would never know there was a genocide happening. You would never know what's happening in Haiti or other places. So I suppose what I mean is more, how did that register? It's okay to speak at that register, or it seems to be more okay now to say, like, Gaza. In some liberal spaces, you can talk about Gaza. But to work publicly and concretely through the questions of our time seems to be not necessary when talking about decolonial questions. And I'm wondering how we arrive there methodologically.
Yeah.
Okay, Said on human rights. Said says, and I use this as the epigraph to my previous book on Glissant. Said says in an essay that to be for human rights means to choose to engage the language of the dominant power in the same places as those dominant actors, while trying to show not how things are separated, but how everything is entangled and linked. So, in a way, I don't think his concept is that different in its history, or, but I think I read him, what I find so powerful in a way, and it's really studying Stuart Hall that has taken me here, is this sense that of starting from the widely legible, flawed concept that is used in all these problematic ways in international law historically, or whatever it is, but to try to re-articulate it or leverage it in a way that says, oh, you claim to be interested in human rights. The vision of what that looks like is not the current vision we're seeing. It's actually this other thing. And let me make that argument following from these given premises. And
that leads me to one of the key concepts that you talked about, which I want to hear more about. When you're talking about entanglement, what do you have in mind? Are you using it philosophically? And if so, what is the intellectual, what are the intellectual affordances that it brings, and what is the intellectual baggage that it also brings? Because any concept is its affordances, what it enables you to do. But like you're saying, but at the same time, there's a certain baggage that each concept brings with it.
Yes.
I completely agree with you also that these concepts have more or less a life, they have a trajectory. They rise and they fall. But I'm interested to try and get a sense from you as a philosopher what entanglement means. Because we have a book that is just coming out now called Entanglement. But I'm sort of curious now to hear from somebody else what goes through your mind when you are talking about entanglement.
Yes, I'm thinking of a few things. And, I have to confess, when I talk about this, sometimes I get asked the question of whether I'm still doing philosophy in a way. So you talked about the philosophical elements, and I'll be interested in what the group
said, oh yes, they will jump in.
thanks. But and in a way, I mean, as you saw, I joke with people. I had few friends after defending human rights in the Glissant book, and now I'm on a trajectory toward no friends defending the human, because I'm okay with that baggage. The insight from Stuart Hall and Politics Without Guarantees for me has been that is often discussed as a limitation, but I found extremely liberating, is that all of these concepts come with tremendous baggage. And so the question shifts in a way of what to do. But entanglements for me, with Glissant, really, for me, Glissant is the thinker of entanglement. And I'm thinking of the most concrete ordinary things possible. I mean, each month I pay my, I pay my taxes each year. Each month I, contribute to my university retirement, whatever. And that implicates me, entangles me in weapons all across the world. That, I have no idea who made my clothes. I have no idea who picked the spinach I eat every day. So as we live in a more and more entangled world, materially, I see people sometimes say this isn't philosophy, but I see it as a tremendous site for all sorts of philosophical questions. Of course, responsibility, these ethical questions. Well, do I owe something to this person who made my shirt, but also political questions of that. In a way, here I'm going to contradict myself. I mean, this is why I find the double helpful, because the 20th century vocabulary I find still so necessary, at the same time as the world becomes increasingly, Glissant would say creolized, Stuart Hall would say diasporic, whatever. I'm thinking of COVID or climate change. The conceptual work can no longer, it doesn't make sense to just talk about a nation or something, so I take your point there as well on new, more concepts, perhaps responding to the changing situation.
This is very interesting. I want to paraphrase a point that was made by a colleague, Cecile Vigoro, in a foreword that she wrote to a book. And she said that it's always important to ask people, or to ask oneself, why one is interested in specific topics at a particular point in time. So my question to you, Ben, is why are you interested in these issues now? It's more or less like, why now? Why couldn't these topics be of interest to you? Or perhaps they have been. But it's interesting to try and understand why now? Why are these issues important to this particular scholar at this specific point in time in their career?
Yeah. I mean, for me, what I want to be careful how to say it. Something that our students have done. This way, student protesters, have, I think, opened up, reignited these intense questions about what a university is or should be. And what is the role of academics and intellectuals in this time. And I felt in writing this book, which is an extremely rushed book in a lot of ways, trying to think together with groups like you all amidst this moment, as opposed to reflecting 10 years down the road or something. Is to think of the openings. This is why I'm so compelled by Said's insistence on the idea. I hear him sort of saying, don't think of these struggles as separate in a way. Think about, why is it in the at the same time in the US, for instance, right now where I work, it's very risky to talk about Palestine, but it's also risky to talk about the indigenous nations who lived on the land of the university and were displaced to make way for a public university. And that, I hear Said saying, that connection we can raise in this moment, or is being raised in this moment. The reason we can't talk about these issues are connected. So I want to tap into that energy, thinking that we have this moment of opening to connect these struggles.
Okay, let me ask my last question, then I hand over to Phoebe. What I find interesting about your work and the little that I have read is how careful you think through these ideas. But now let me ask you a much more concrete aspect. Pedagogically, how do you teach Said to a group of undergraduate students who may have very little knowledge about philosophy? How do you go about your craft of teaching?
Well, I wish I had a better answer. I mean, to be totally honest, AI and the smartphones we've had, for only 10 years or whatever it's been, I think have in some ways so destroyed the brains of so many of us, myself included, to a great extent. If I think about how email has just destroyed my brain, how much I check my email. And so I find myself, I can't even talk about these ideas so much because they require an ability to really sit with complexity over time, and you can't do that in a AI summary. You can't do that in a class. So I think of myself almost as a teacher of reading more than anything, where we just look at like one paragraph at a time. Okay, do we know what all the words mean? Okay, we don't know some of them. Let's define them. All right, now having defined the terms, what is this person saying? So, and my hope is down the road, in upper level classes, as I've been teaching introductory classes the last 3 years, then maybe we can get into some of these debates.
Okay.
But I confess, I mostly think of myself as a teacher of reading.
Interesting. Thanks a lot, Ben. This has been a fascinating conversation. Let me hand over to Phoebe.
Thank you for your engagement, Professor McConey. It's a real honor.
Thank you very much, Professor McConey and Dr. Davis. Scott, you're on.
Thanks so much, Phoebe, and thanks so much, Dr. Davis, for a really interesting talk. I find a lot of this very compelling. I think too often philosophers like to kind of, stake out space and then say which other philosophers aren't worth taking seriously. Kind of the Marxist podcasting philosopher who's like, anyone who cites Hannah Arendt is not serious, or anyone who cites continental philosophy is not serious. And I think there's a tendency or a potential for decolonial philosophy to also sort of be the same thing, that somehow anyone who's been found to be colonial is somehow unserious. So I wanted to ask you about a potential challenge, because I find it compelling, but I want to ask you about a challenge that comes to mind. So if we invoke the discourse of nations and of rights, if only strategically, Leanne Better-Samosaki Simpson has written that like indigenous land, sort of the horizon of that kind of politics is about nation building, not nation state building, right? Yeah. Trying to say that there is a kind of a nation that is not a nation state, and there are versions of the nation that we can hold on to. But when we start talking about rights, it almost inevitably kind of starts invoking some kind of liberal nation state that you can actually claim the right from. And then, the objections start coming, well, what is the state? Is it just the liberal state as, the liberal nation state as we know it? Are we merely kind of repairing that thing in seeking recognition from it? And then some decolonial philosophers, I think Jairo Funes has recently written something on this, will tell us that we're being counterinsurgents. We are, in participating in the politics of recognition. We are, not being revolutionary. We're merely reforming our notion of the state as it already exists, and we're affirming sort of a liberal horizon. So how would you respond to something like that?
Well, I'm glad you asked this question. I mean, for me, and I've written about this in Choose Your Bearing, in the second chapter in Choose Your Bearing, Standing Rock was influential, and I've spent time over the years in different capacities working with the Chucuru Nation in Brazil, and there were all sorts of rights claims at Standing Rock, and the Chucuru leverage all sorts of rights claims. And part of it is by necessity, because the law is, one of the many tools the state has used to maintain dispossession. But part of it is not just strategic. And I found this, I was living a divided existence for a while, in a way, because at all the conferences I would go to, I would get questions like this. Thinking, whether it's thinking with Marx and Marx's on the Jewish question, where he makes this critique very forcefully that has influenced a lot of us, of the rights claims necessarily ensnare us with property, right? Or the critique of the liberal position, rights claims, as you're saying, ensnare us with the state. But I found compelling, and I think this is our task as readers in a way. We could read the ICJ work of South Africa, or we could read the ICJ work of Vanuatu around states' obligations for climate change as simply further ensnaring us in something. But I think as readers, it's also worth reflecting that I like to think other people are smarter than me. And then if they are, then they're using this, knowing that it is an engagement with the state perhaps, but they have to do that as to get coverage. Vanuatu wasn't getting coverage by the Washington Post and the Guardian until it got this case, pushed through the ICJ. And then as we all wait for advisory opinions, whatever, I think we can have the larger ethical reflection on, well, this is about states' obligations, but it's also about my life. It's about whether I'm a tourist. It's about how I engage with other people. And I saw that similarly happening with rights claims at Standing Rock. It was used to connect struggles, and name wrongs that were happening with connecting Standing Rock to Black Lives Matter, connecting Standing Rock to Palestine, connecting Standing Rock to Puerto Rico. So I no longer think that rights claims or any language, necessarily ensnares us, though it does run that risk. But I don't believe in the necessity of that.
Thank you.
Thank you too. Lynn Mario was having a problem, so Lynn Mario, you can go.
Thank you, Phoebe. Thanks for that, Benjamin. I'm speaking from Sao Paulo, Brazil. I come to ethics from a or as Sinfrey mentioned, the decolonial fashion, from an older perspective of Enrique Dusso, right?
Yes.
And his critique of discourse ethics, right? And where he saw discourse ethics as being basically taking into account a local sensitivity, a local meaning a north-centric power-centric conception of, let's say, Eurocentric conception of what ethics should be, or what humanity is, and what ethics as a good life or practical practice for a good life would be, and universalizing it. Right? And so what his critique of that Habermas discourse ethic perspective was that it lacks materiality. Right? The materiality being the body of those who suffer in oppressed, marginalized situations. Right? So basically what he was saying, or what he seemed to have been saying, was that it's very difficult to talk about ethics from a universal standpoint. You should take into account the material standpoint, the body suffering of people in fighting for real existence, those whose everyday life means they confront death, right? So this would be a material ethics as opposed to a universal ethics. But basically, what you've pointed out in what you said, this idea of this double interpretation, Derrida's concept of double interpretation, or Said's concept of perhaps of the counterpoint, right?
Yeah.
So what we are talking about here is the local universal kind of counterpoint when we are talking about ethics. Right? And this is extremely important when we are talking about these concepts such as humanity, the nation. Scott just mentioned different takes on the nation. And here I'm wondering about, in Brazil, the indigenous issues and racism. So what it comes out as, in Brazil, when we tend to speak in our academic context of decoloniality, we speak from a supposedly self-centric perspective of having been colonized. But in Brazil, where 90% of the academics are white, racism is not part of the issue when they're talking about decoloniality. Right? So what has happened there, in my interpretation? So decoloniality, which started from a critique of the universalization of colonial epistemology, and so now we're looking at colonization from a local colonized perspective. But then that so-called colonized perspective is still taking a universalized, meaning in terms of Brazil, a white-centric and not a non-white centric perspective. So when we speak of decoloniality in Brazil, we're not, very rarely do we, unless we are not, it's a non-white, one of the very few non-white intellectuals we have, you don't take into account the indigenous issue or racism in Brazil, which affect 57% of the population. So, and you see, we use the concept of our most influential, let's say, anti-colonial, perhaps decolonial avant-la-lettre thinker, who was Paulo Freire, right? So when Paulo Freire said we have to begin from the local, but then using his perhaps Marxist influence, you have to overcome your local consciousness, because it's your local consciousness which has conditioned you to think from an alienated perspective. Right? So his proposal for education is all towards taking into first being made aware of your local consciousness, but then to have access to literacy, which will liberate you from that local, the alienation which your local consciousness has put you into. So it's as if the universal will liberate us from the local. But then as Dussel says, the universal is also somebody's local, right? So I'm wondering, I'd just like to hear your take on this. So is this a case of double interpretation and counterpoint that we're dealing with when we're talking about universal ethics? It's universal, but let's see who's speaking from where. What would you say to that?
Obrigado, Mario. I would say I see important differences between Dussel and Said, and that is mainly that Dussel is Levinasian, you know, and Dussel's, and so the analectical move for Dussel and exterioridad as a kind of, you know, reading of alterity in Levinas, that then you also get Dussel's Christian background. So then it's the not just the other, but the poor and the widow and the orphan. So, you know, on the one hand, Dussel makes Levinas a little bit more concrete, but because of his emphasis on exterioridad, then this Levinasian inheritance has left us with all of these questions, epistemological and communication questions. Well, can I communicate with this other person, or should I somewhat still view them with reverence in an almost religious way? You know, Levinas says, I reserve the term religion for the ethical relation in totality and infinity. So I see that, I mean, on the one hand, to your point with Freire and education in Brazil, and Dussel's influence as a teacher, to go back to Professor McConey's concrete question, is itself something, and was so influential for so many in Latin America. But the conceptual legacy he left us with, I think, is substantially different from Said's counterpoint, because Said was always against this idea of the alterity of the capital O other, and wanted to put together a more legible conversation, especially in the later, reflections on exile, and it's very different to my ear from Dussel's insistence in Ethics of Liberation and other places on exterioridad. So I've spent a lot of time with Dussel. I met him a few years ago before he passed. I mourn that loss, and now view all of his diagrams and his books as kind of playful, though he's very serious, but I've become less sympathetic to that portrayal of the ethical relationship over time, and more sympathetic to with Glissant and others, a critique of alterity.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Spears.
Thanks a lot for your talk. And from where I'm situated in academia, it's very nice to hear from a philosopher, because it reminds me that I can think about things in a different way, or discourse about them in a different way. So thanks for that. And that's not a minor thing.
All right.
I want to follow up on Lynn Mario's comments. Lynn, you snatched the words from my mouth. And I really liked your comment about complexity. And I was thinking that complexity is actually an entree. Okay. And an entree to what? An entree to intent, goal, and function. And what I see, and this relates to Sinfree's point about African intellectuals being largely sidelined in discussions about decolonial thinking, etc. And I get to the point that racism, white supremacy, and structures based on similar concepts are implicated in everything we're talking about, but rarely mentioned. For example, where is Haiti in discussions about decoloniality? It's mentioned maybe a tiny bit more than it was 60 years ago, but still there's a big problem. And what we see, to sort of summarize it, is that the whole problem of racist and racialized like thinking are too often excluded from the conversation. Yet, that nexus is implicated in everything we're talking about. Uh, it's almost as though there's a system of etiquette at our conferences and in our anthologies is don't bring up race because it complicates things too much or it's too uncomfortable for some people. I'll give a quick example. When I went to study in Latin America, I was in a very Marxist-oriented student environment, and there was a highly suppressed Black community in the country, Uruguay. I didn't even know they were there until I had been in Uruguay 6 months. And they lived only blocks from where I lived. They were behind downtown and in the recesses of the port area. And the university intellectuals would talk about how the United States treats and has treated Latin American countries. And at a certain point, I would just get tired. What about how you treat the Black people here in Uruguay? And of course, they would get into a discussion about class, and it's not really race. And of course, I got into my rebuttal about that whole thing. I said, it's class. It's not about whether it's class or race. It's always class and race and gender and sexuality and religion. They all work together for this stratification that we're dealing with. And that's another term that infuses everything that we're concerned with, stratification. And when we talk about intent, goal, function, we get into stratification. I would say one of the primary stratificational systems in the world now is the racial one, based loosely and often foolishly on phenotypical features. So if I apply that to one particular situation, the Palestinian one, whenever Palestine comes up, in my mind, I think of the question of how are Black Palestinians treated? And what do we do that with that? They're treated very poorly. But we can't single out Palestinians because those conceptualized as Black are treated very poorly in all of the Arab countries and in some other countries, of course, Iraq, Syria, so on and so forth. And they do have Black populations. So my question would be, what do you think about these gaps and silences in our talk of liberation and humanity and so on and so forth? Should we follow the etiquette of so much of our activity where you play nice and you don't bring up Blackness and white supremacy and so on and so forth? How do we make the discussion? How do we better ground the discussion in talking about these things? So I am burdening you with that question, so to speak.
I don't think of it that way.
Just as a footnote, I'd like to hear you say more about Bisson, but we probably don't have time. I just received the readings yesterday, so I haven't had a chance to read them.
We will have time in the after parties. So
yeah. So what do you think? That's not a complaint. It's just an observation. So what do you?
No, it's a good
inform us.
It's a good point, and I think what has been most striking for me, and I try to talk about this in the introduction to, I don't know how successful I was, but thinking about Stuart Hall's sense, number one, that the politics of race doesn't just fall from the sky and is connected to countries and companies' interests in a way. And the most concrete example I can think of has been the way that you have seen people with Ukraine flags and pins and these kind of things, and framing that as a refugee question with no previous or contemporary sympathy for other refugee populations, but a particular, maybe sometimes sympathy, and saying I'm thinking of Christian refugees. But of course, there are Christian Palestinian refugees, there are Christian Nigerian refugees, if we're thinking of, just by the numbers of refugees. So that has been striking. I've tried to make that point, in classes or other times. How did that happen in everyone has a flag all of a sudden, and what that says about, I think it's part of your point, in inability to think about true universalization, as Césaire would say, made to the measure of the world. So I hear that point. That's why I was careful in introducing my how helpful I found some of Erasmus's concepts, given her orientation as well. And I mean, I think also to Professor McConey's question about teaching, teaching in Texas, I've only been here for a year, has been interesting on this question as well. And there's been an ongoing systematic suppression of conversations around race. Often now, I don't know if you all have experienced it this way, particularly white people will cite Martin Luther King and the desire to be judged by character and not skin color, without reading anything else King said, or trying to think through, as you're saying, the different stratifications, and that land in this space is already tied to questions of race, and that curriculum and is already tied to questions of race. So I hear that point. I don't have much of an answer, but I've been writing about it more through the lens of coverage of Ukraine versus other places.
And humanity itself, that notion, we can think of all the isms as stratifying and subclassifying humanity into more human, less human.
Right.
occurs to me as I think about it. But thanks.
Thank you so much. Musna, you can go.
Hi, thank you, Benjamin, so much. It's nice to meet you also. My name is Musna and I'm Palestinian.
Hello.
And I happen also to be an Israeli citizen. So I'm a member of the indigenous Palestinian community, and I speak from a place of entanglement. So just to connect this to what Professor Makoni said, but also to what Lynn Mario said about the local. And I would like also to use Lynn Mario's notion of the locus of enunciation, where since the war on Gaza began following October, 2023, the question of the human and, how to refigure the human has been of great concern to me, also from an applied linguistic perspective, from the language, where most of us here are scholars of language. And I have been really concerned, inspired by the work of Christopher Stroud and, other, but also, Sylvia Wynter and Hannah Arendt about, with the role that language figures, or how do we use language, or how can we employ language in order to refigure the human? And it was there that I remember that I was really inspired again by Edward Said, with whom I share, not only roots, but also the same dilemma of being here, but not being from here, and being Palestinian, but not being fully Palestinian. For Israelis, they look at me as if I'm, with suspicion, and in the eyes of Palestinians outside the Green Line or Palestinians in the diaspora, okay, they look at Palestinians who remained inside Israel also with suspicion. So it's you're never in the right place in a way. You're never in the right place. And I had to wonder, okay, where I am on the scale of humanity also. So where are Palestinians on the scale of humanity? And then once you start with this question, with this thinking, and if you are a decolonial scholar, then you will think, okay, but wait, can I engage with the notion of human? Because human is the construction of modern decoloniality. So can we use human, or can we, because this is the same term that was used in order to create the subhumans and to create the non-humans and, to dehumanize others. So, and this is why I think I have been listening and trying to, think with Professor Makoni and with Scott and with Lynn Mario and with Dr. Spears. How do we kind of, compensate, or how do we navigate all of these contradictions? And the decolonial context has been a little bit colonial itself, and has been working with this colonial mindset. And I give an example where I was almost bullied for referring to myself as a human, because from a decolonial, or from the perspective of some decolonial scholars, this was colonialist. Like, how do you use humanist, or how do you use the term human? So I wonder, sorry for complicating things, but I think that this is exactly how me and my relationship with humanity are these days. It's a total chaos, and it's a total distrust. And it's
thank you.
It's coming from a place of okay, so I cannot but look at the bottom of recording, because I know that I'm recorded, but I'm also so I know what I'm, just like you said, we have to be careful about everything that we say, especially from the place that I'm speaking from now. But I wonder, how can we, as scholars, in this case, scholars of language, but scholars of critical thinking, okay, about language issues, the relation between language and society, but also language and philosophy. How do you see us kind of, moving within this entangled, contested, chaotic, also disciplinary world, where, people are not really tolerant about complex loci of enunciation. People are more, seem to be more redividing the word than, building coalitions or building solidarities. And I feel it as a Palestinian who has to justify, okay, my Palestinianness all the time, and who has also, to justify, okay, to Israelis that I'm entitled to be recognized on my own terms and not on, the terms of the Israeli hegemonic ideology about who the Palestinians, who remained in Israel are. So. Yeah. So I hope that you are also familiar with the complexity and with the, with what does it mean to be a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship. And I wonder what you have to say, or how do you reflect on all of these chaotic things that I shared. Thank you.
Yeah. It's interesting to me, your story about being told by decolonial scholars that you're reintroducing colonialism by identifying as human. I mean, that is really representative of so many academic spaces. And it has never made sense to me. Now, I mean, this is a different context, but similar to thinking with Scott's question, the land struggles I have been to a small extent a part of. I had no problem using the human either to refer to the community that was gathered at the prayer camp or to stop the pipeline. I mean, it wasn't, and if you said in that space, if you said at the prayer camp, we shouldn't call ourselves human or something, I think my guess is it would have been looked on strangely, like, where are you? Well, I mean, okay. So because of that sense from practice, it has never made sense to me. And it also speaks to, I think, the great academic skill of dividing and fragmenting our efforts, as if political questions were ultimately questions of language. I mean, and in fact, to Professor Spear's question about Haiti, I have always found Michel Rouve-Trouillot helpful in his insistence, talking about the nation state, that these things are not just spoken, but they're ultimately lived. We somehow live out the concepts, and so the academic ability to make everything a question of how we talk and then divide the group because of differences in language, I struggle with, and is not my orientation. And I don't think it was Said's, and I don't think it was Said's, in part because he was actually involved in political work where that would maybe have not been an acceptable form of engagement toward the other person. So to the chat question, it's Michel Rouve-Trouillot. I can send you, I quote Trouillot at the end of the introduction, if that was sent around. But nice to meet you.
Well, thank you very much. I don't see any other hands, so I think we can safely transition to after party where the recording is off and people can be free to ask anything on their minds. Dr. Marconi, if you'd like to thank our presenter, and we will stop the recording and we will, yes. All right, okay, there we go.